First Lieutenant Sanae Harada's tank was the fourth knocked out. Initially, Harada was unable to leave the vehicle because of the heavy fire. He could hear the bullets bouncing off the armor plate. When the barrage abated, he managed to escape while the tank burned. The 5th Chiha, #2 tank, 1st Platoon, commanded by Sergeant Seizu Watanbe, toppled into the river, killing 2, though 2 escaped. The 6th tank, #3 of the 1st Platoon, took a direct hit that killed the commander, miscreant Minoru Tanaka, and 3 others. The next tank, #1 of the 3rd Platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant Hiroyasu Yamaji with Captain Mayada, was stopped by a direct shot before it entered the river. Only Sergeant Y. Nishimoto escaped. The tank with Sergeant Mitsuo Koshikawa was next, and as it began to cross the river, it took a direct hit. Mitsuo was killed, but the driver and gunner escaped. The last tank adjacent to the river, #2 of the command platoon, driven by Seaplotted Atsuji Ishii, was damaged by shellfire from the 11th Marines, as was Captain Mayada's tank that had been stalled on the coast route. The #3 tank, 3rd Platoon, that was damaged earlier was also crushed. 30 tankers were killed in the skirmish. The Marines had wreaked havoc on men and machines, and the remnants were forced to return up the coast route. The Japanese assault had been halted so suddenly that the few surviving infantrymen withdrew. About midnight, however, the 4th Infantry made another attempt to charge across the river farther upstream, but that effort also was blunted. When the attack was over, the 1st Marines listed 25 killed and 14 wounded. They estimated the Japanese losses at 600. Japanese artillery continued its intermittent fire during the day on the 24th, and during the afternoon 2 incidents foretold a serious situation for the Americans. The 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, which was holding the southeast line of the forward position of the Matanikau sector along Hill 67, observed an enemy unit moving eastward over the Mount Austin foothills, some 1,000 yards to the south. It was an area the 7th Marines had travelled a month earlier. Apparently the Japanese had crossed the upper Matanikau hoping to outflank that forward position. The 11th Marines artillery immediately directed fire to the area, and the Cactus Air Force lifted off to strike. The enemy column evaporated within the jungle, however, and the bombing and strafing were ineffective. The enemy was not to be deterred, for not long afterward, in a second incident at 2200 on the 24th, the fireworks started again when the Japanese attacked the southwest flank of Bloody Ridge. They were met by an effective response from the 1st and 5th Battalions, 11th Marines, who fired in support of the threatened 7th Marines, while the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, fired in support of the 164th Infantry Regiment. Colonel Akinosuke Oka's force of General Kawaguchi's wing was to hit the airfield from the right bank of the Lunga River and move to the southwest side of Mount Austin. The 124th Infantry, less the 3rd Battalion, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Infantry, half of the 4th Infantry gun unit under Captain Kunio Sato, 1 squad of a mobile radio unit also from the 4th Infantry, the 10th Independent Mountain Artillery Regiment, less 1 platoon, under Lieutenant Colonel Masaji Kitayama, the 4th Company under 1st Lieutenant Katsuyoshi Tokuyama, the 5th Company under 1st Lieutenant Torasaburo Kato, and the 6th Company under Captain Masatoshi Oka. The 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry Regiment, was the spearhead of Colonel Oka's force, with the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, less the 10th Company, in the second line. The 164th Infantry's position on Bloody Ridge was turned over to Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, which was ordered to the Matanikau to relieve the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. John Hoffman writes, "On October 20th, the 1/7th moved back into the lines, reassuming responsibility for the left half of the 7th Marines sector, while 2 7ths, Lieutenant Colonel Herman H. Hanneken, contracted into the right half. The men went to work again improving their defences, which Puller considered only 30% complete. Despite his low estimate, it was a formidable position. In addition to fire lanes, barbed wire, bunkers and fighting holes, both battalions were generously equipped with heavy weapons. Each had a normal complement of mortars, 6 60mm and 4 81mm, and .30 caliber machine guns, 24 heavy and 6 light. Infantry battalions also rated a pair of 50 caliber machine guns. The regiment had 3 anti-air, anti-tank guns and 4 37mm anti-tank guns. Following the tank attack of the 23rd and the observation of the enemy movements the next afternoon, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, moved into position to cover the break between the Matanikau sector and the Lungs perimeter, with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, and Edson's 5th Marines in the Lungs perimeter. The discovery of the Japanese 124th Infantry adjacent to the Matanikau sector was followed by the report of a second force, indicating that a two-pronged attack might be in progress. The Leathernecks of Puller's battalion, now spread thin over an extended front, awaited the attack. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, the Division Reserve, bivouacked north of the airstrip. By noon on the 24th, elements of the 35th Brigade had crossed the Lunga River and were positioned in the dense jungle east of the river and south of Edson's Ridge. On the left centre were Colonel Shojiro Komiya's 29th Infantry, less the 2nd Battalion, and Captain Satoru Suzuki's 7th Company, along with elements of the 124th Infantry, the 3rd Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Engineer Regiment under 1st Lieutenant Goro Ichijo, and part of the 6th Independent Rapid-Fire Gun Battalion, 1st Company under Captain Kazuo Kitayama, equipped with 20mm anti-tank weapons. Elements of the Shoji Butai prepared to attack to the east. Their heaviest weapons were machine guns, as most of the artillery pieces and the Type 97 81mm and Type 98 heavy mortars had been abandoned along the 282 Hells Islands Trail, a lack of firepower that certainly placed the Japanese at a disadvantage. The Marine Line Rifle companies were supported by their heavy weapons and artillery, as well as the weapons of the 164th Company M, one heavy machine gun section of its Company H, and its 37mm anti-tank guns, an array of machine guns lined up bumper to bumper. The 164th was spread out on a 1,000-yard front with the 4 canister-firing 37mm anti-tank guns it had borrowed from the 7th Marines. These weapons were influential in a close encounter, as they would cover heights as tall as a boxcar, and a good gun loader could pack 20 canister shells per minute. Events unfolded quickly that afternoon. CPL George C. McGillivray of the 17th Weapons Company had manned gun hash one of the 37mm anti-tank weapons. He recalled, "In front of my position on the ridge, a mass of infantrymen were attempting to bust through the barbed wire, just at a wired gate, when I let go a canister shot of rusty nails and spent shells, killing the lot." One enemy soldier was later identified as Sergeant Yomishito of the 29th Infantry. The other 337s of Weapons 1/7th also blazed away, mowing down the oncoming Japanese. That night, H-27 fired more than 1,081mm mortar rounds, which helped paralyze the rush. Captain Juro Katsumata, commander of the 11th Company, 29th Infantry, was part of the 2nd Division attack. His notes support many of the previously documented details of the Japanese advance and assault, but add his own experience to the mix. His observations provide a narrative that begins with the night of the 12th of October, when the destroyer Shirayuki had closed in toward Guadalcanal's northwest coast near Tasafaronga, landing 140 men of his 11th Company, 29th Infantry Regiment. According to Captain Katsumata, the company was immediately assigned to guard duties on Hill 96, 1 mile west of Point Cruz. Although the hill was only 5 miles from where the company had disembarked, the men travelled 3 days to reach it, as they were constantly machine-gunned and bombed by American planes, and could move only by night. From Hill 96, Captain Katsumata's company guarded the sea flank of the Maruyama Trail that had been cut through the 35 miles of jungle by General Maruyama's engineers as part of his planned attack against Henderson Field from the south. On the 16th of October, Katsumata's men joined the main force of General Maruyama's 2nd Division and set off along the trail on their way to the planned airfield assault. They found the first day's march to be relatively effortless as they passed through coconut groves along the coast, then over a range of hills inland. On the second day, however, they entered dense, hilly forest land, and Katsumata noted how the trail had become so narrow that they had to travel single file. They soon approached a series of steep hills, slippery from the rain, and covered in thick undergrowth. Katsumata wrote that progress was slow in the hot, humid jungle, and the hills were so steep that ropes, blocks and tackles had to be used to haul the 70mm cannon up the inclines. By the third day, he added, the men were slowing even more, becoming exhausted. Captain Katsumata noted that he sent his NCO along the line to lash the men with canes in a desperate attempt to drive them forward. Katsumata details that General Maruyama realized that the column was getting behind schedule and thus sent a message to General Sumiyoshi at the Matanikau River to postpone the planned combined attack on the airfield by 24 hours. He put the men on half rations, as their advance was taking longer than expected, and their supplies were potentially inadequate. On the fourth day, Katsumata notes, the men hauling the guns simply abandoned them along with other heavy equipment. Machine guns, mortars, and boxes of ammunition began to litter the trail as the men sought to rid themselves of everything except their most essential equipment. Heavy rain slowed their progress even more as they slipped on the muddy, steep hills and the sides of ravines. After 5 days, Captain Katsumata's 11th Company had covered only 26 miles, and again General Maruyama was forced to postpone the planned assault. On the afternoon of the 24th of October, Katsumata describes the 2nd Division finally reaching a position 2 miles south of Henderson Field. The 9th Company under Lieutenant Yukio Makita was then sent forward to probe the American defences, and Captain Katsumata's 11th Company was ordered to follow Makita's 9th tie and support it. The 11th and 9th Companies set off at 1500 in heavy rain through the thick jungle toward the airfield. By nightfall, they had made limited progress and had seen nothing of the American forces. The darkness settled in so completely that it was difficult to see the man in front, and Captain Katsumata wrote that he and his men lost contact with the 9th Company. At that point, he ordered his troops to place their hands on the shoulders of the man in front, and in this manner they pushed on. At 2100, they found an American telephone line, which they cut. However, realizing this might alert the Americans, Katsumata ordered his men to search along the line and eliminate any American listening posts they found. As Katsumata's men traveled down the cable, a voice from the jungle called his name. It was Lieutenant Makita, from whom they had been separated earlier. He and 10 of his men had been moving back when they heard Katsumata's troops. Makita told Katsumata that after being separated from Katsumata's company, he and his men had proceeded forward until they came to a field with a line of barbed wire across it. Lieutenant Nakagome of the 2nd Platoon had wanted to lead a patrol through the field, but Makita denied the request, as it might draw the attention of the Americans and subvert the regiment's attack later. At that point, Katsumata states, he and Lieutenant Makita took their men back to the field, and Katsumata sent a squad to the right to reconnoitre. Across the field, he could see what appeared to be a line of empty trenches. As he was discussing the situation with Lieutenant Makita, a sudden burst of machine gun fire came from their right, toward the squad he had sent out. As the men hurried back, a second machine gun opened fire from the left. Katsumata writes that he hid at the edge of the jungle, watching the coloured tracers stream across the night. He realized that the 2 guns would have to be destroyed before he could move across the field, and thus he sent back a request for a squad of engineers with dynamite to come forward. To his dismay, he learned that the dynamite had been dumped on the Maruyama trail earlier by the exhausted engineers. Katsumata then gave orders for a machine gun to be set up to counter the American guns, while his men advanced across the field. As Katsumata was talking to his NCOs, Major Eiji Mizuno arrived, the 2nd Battalion commander of the Ichiki detachment. He had been drawn by the firing. Major Mizuno disagreed with Captain Katsumata's plan for taking out the American machine guns, and instead ordered him to send 1 squad to the right to destroy the gun there, while Katsumata led the rest of his men across the field and then turned left to take the other weapon from behind. At this point, Captain Katsumata's notes indicate that he realized his men were wet, tired, and hungry, and also probably apprehensive and frightened at the thought of their first attack against the Americans. He was concerned that some of them would panic or get lost in a night attack, and thus he would follow the major's order and lead them across the field in a short rush, keeping them together. After he sent the squad to the right, he took the rest of his men to the edge of the field and passed his instructions to the NCOs. Katsumata states that the rain had stopped by then. The clouds were beginning to break up, and the moon shone through occasionally. Across the field, he could see a large tree and told his men that it would be their initial objective, after which they would swing to the left as Major Kuramoto had ordered. The men ran forward in a rush for 30 yards, then hit the ground. The Americans were still firing intermittently, but the tracers were passing over their heads. Captain Katsumata had been lying prone and could not see the tree, but after a word to an NCO, he crawled forward 20 yards until it was within his vision. Katsumata notes that as he turned to go back to his men, he was horrified to see them all suddenly get up, start shouting, and charge over to the left. He quickly ran after them, calling for them to lie down and be quiet. But it was too late. The American machine guns lowered their fire, and the men in one section were cut to pieces. Dozens fell with bullet wounds in their chest, waist, or legs. In addition, they had run into a minefield, and a line of explosions erupted among them, flinging men into the air. From the light of the explosions, the rest of Katsumata's men could be plainly seen, and the American fire instantly shifted to them. Within moments, Katsumata states, he caught up with his men and ordered them to lie down. From the darkness nearby, a soldier shouted that he had found some barbed wire. The captain realized that they could not stay there with fire from both flanks and barbed wire ahead, and thus he crawled forward to the wire, then worked his way along it until he came upon a part that was only 2 feet high. He called to his men that the wire at that point was low enough for them to jump over it. When Katsumata stood up to go over the wire, 2 bullets immediately hit him. One grazed his right cheekbone, tore his helmet strap, and took off his right earlobe. The second grazed his right knee. He hardly felt either projectile as he jumped over the barbed lines, running forward some 20 yards before falling to the ground. Above the din of the continual firing and the screaming of the wounded, Katsumata states he called repeatedly to his men to join him. A short time later, from out of the black of the night, First Lieutenant Kanichiro Shirai of Headquarters Company and 2 others appeared. The firing stopped, and Katsumata sent Lieutenant Shirai back to the wire to bring the rest of the men forward. Katsumata writes that after several minutes Shirai returned alone. He had found no one alive. Not long after that, Captain Katsumata stated he could hear the rustling of grass about 50 yards to his left. He thought it might be the 9th Company, which Kurimoto had ordered to support him. Then suddenly he heard the voice of Second Lieutenant Kimio Nakagome shouting, "Kogeki! Kogeki! Attack! Attack!" and the rush of men toward the wire. Katsumata instantly called a warning to them, but at that moment the American machine gun fire broke out again from both sides. The agonized screams of the wounded filled the night air, yet above it all Katsumata could hear Nakagome still urging his men forward. The American attack increased in intensity, and a 3rd machine gun directly ahead of Katsumata began firing. Nakagome's men seemed to have reached the wire as again Captain Katsumata heard, "Kogeki! Kogeki!" and then a piercing scream of pain, after which he heard Lieutenant Nakagome no more. The firing continued for several minutes. The cries of the wounded and moans from near the barbed wire were everywhere, but eventually they faded, and Katsumata was almost overwhelmed by the silence. He notes that as the moon broke through the clouds, he looked at his watch and could see the hands near midnight, only 30 minutes since he had led his men into the field. Then the shelling started. Most of the barrage landed in the jungle on the other side of the field. Unknown to Katsumata at the time, the shelling broke up Japanese forces moving toward his position. A shell burst nearby tore off the top of a tree, sending it crashing to the ground only 10 yards from Katsumata's small group. Sensing potential shelter, the men crawled towards the huge tree and hid beneath it. A short time later, a shell hit near the barbed wire, and shrapnel whipped through the air, hitting the captain in the right ankle, Lieutenant Seiichi Shirai in the left leg, and one of the soldiers in the hip. A few minutes later, more shrapnel tore into the chest of the second soldier, who died within minutes. Throughout that night, Katsumata states, the 3 survivors huddled close to the ground as the shelling continued. Captain Katsumata hoped that his comrades' successive attacks would sweep toward his position, but as the night wore on, the charges became fewer and weaker. He realized that if they stayed there, they would be shot by the Americans as soon as dawn broke. He decided to go back across the field and look for the squad he had sent toward the right. Lieutenant Shirai thought it would be impossible to get back, and that they should commit kamikaze before the Americans found them. As Shirai raised his pistol, Katsumata tells that he put his hand on Shirai's shoulder and told him they could do that at any time, but they had to try to make another attack before dawn. Machine gun fire was still occasionally kicking up the dirt nearby the men, but after watching for a clear run, Katsumata dashed to the wire. When he reached it, he found 4 or 5 of his men dead, hanging over it. He climbed across and in short dashes made his way back through the field, once stumbling and falling, then discovering he had tripped over the feet of a dead soldier. Looking around, he saw a group of almost 50 dead nearby. Just before dawn, Katsumata notes, he reached the edge of the jungle, then turned off to the right, stopping at intervals and shouting, "This is Katsumata! Gather here! We will attack again!" In about an hour, Katsumata had assembled about 15 survivors. As they stood together, he heard Japanese voices coming toward him through the dense growth. Leaving his men, he moved toward the sound and saw Colonel Shojiro Komiya with about 20 men, including Lieutenant Colonel Katsutoshi Watanabe, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 29th Infantry. Colonel Komiya informed Katsumata that he was preparing for another attack, but Katsumata told the colonel what had happened the previous night and suggested he get some machine gun support. Komiya agreed and sent back for a machine gun detachment, while Captain Katsumata went to gather his 15 men to join in Colonel Komiya's attack. Records show that at 1700, Colonel Watanabe enlisted the help of First Lieutenant Kozaburo Miyazawa, commanding officer of the 2nd Machine Gun Company, 2nd Battalion, 29th Infantry, and they subsequently attacked the centre of Bloody Ridge. Meanwhile, Captain Katsumata's notes show he found that his 15 men had scattered. Only one remained at the place where he had left them. He sent this man to locate the others, and eventually most were gathered again and joined up with Komiya's group. Katsumata then discovered that most of the others had already left for the attack mission, except for Colonel Watanabe, who remained with about 50 of his own men. While the captain and the colonel were discussing the situation, a sudden shout announced that the Americans were coming. They all scattered to take up defensive positions, and Katsumata states he found himself with about 20 men and a light machine gun. They ran to the top of a small hill, but despite the sound of frequent shooting, they saw no enemy troops. After an hour had passed, a runner arrived with a message telling Captain Katsumata to report to brigade headquarters, some 1,000 yards to the rear. When he arrived, he was surprised to find that no one seemed to know what had happened during the night, nor did they have any knowledge of Colonel Komiya's attack that morning. He concluded that the American shelling had probably destroyed the telephone lines. A less graphic version of the fierce encounter was presented by First Lieutenant Kozaburo Miyazawa, commander of the 2nd Machine Gun Company, 29th Infantry, who wrote on the 20th of October, "It was planned to carry out the general attack, but because of the inaccuracy of the maps and unknown terrain, the progress of road construction by the engineers, and the advance of the units, especially the heavy weapons unit, was very slow. Therefore, the general attack was unavoidably postponed to the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th. On the 25th of October, Miyazawa noted, "At 1700 it was planned to enter the enemy's positions together, but because of imperfect communications with the 29th Infantry Regiment, that one regiment did not move to the point of the general attack, and the thrust was completely lost. The POW interrogation of Sup-Purit Yabuchi Ichiji, 6th Company, 2nd Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, also offered a brief view of the events. Immediately after landing, his unit joined the rest of the regiment, and they marched through the jungle to the southeast of the airport. The regiment at that time was estimated to be about 2,000 men. They entered the battle with the 16th Regiment on their right and the 4th Regiment to the west of the airfield. In the resulting night attack, Ichiji stated that they lost 800 men. Regimental Commander Colonel Komiya and the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, were also killed in this battle. The remainder of the unit retired to the beach area in the vicinity of Mamara. PFC Masao Nakagawa, 2nd Platoon, 1st Company, 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion, reported that the men of his company of 12 guns were capable of firing 30 rounds per minute. The 29th Regiment was advancing with the 3rd Battalion under Major Tadao Yoshi in the lead, and the 1st Battalion under Captain Kohei Nakajima on the right, but due to darkness they could not make contact with each other. The 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Katsutoshi Watanabe was to be the reserve, but it followed directly behind the 1st Battalion. Nakagawa states, "I learned during the night of the problems of the vanguard units which intended to join the battle, but the enemy had concentrated its fire on the road, and by dawn only a few members were able to join the attack." The 3rd Battalion ploughed ahead. Even though it was night, the enemy had good fire zones. Major Yoshi, with strong determination, strove to break through, and each company, in accordance with its orders, began the assault. But because of the heavy concentration of machine gun and mortar fire, the breakthrough was impossible. The battalion was having great difficulty and made no progress, but one party got through. By dawn, the enemy fire became more intense, and as a result, the 3rd Battalion, 29th Infantry, was practically annihilated. The Americans watched the assaulting forces drift away. The 17th Army was withdrawing its tattered units to regroup and prepare for another strike. At dawn on the 25th of October, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was fed into the lines of the 7th Marines east of Lunga, covering the south slopes of Bloody Ridge. The 164th Infantry Regiment assumed command of the sector in a draw between the Marines' left flank and the right flank of the 2nd Battalion, 164th Infantry. The doggies of the 3rd Battalion, 164th, were prepared to defend its area with 4 rifle companies, L on the left, K in the centre, and I on the right. Company E of the 164th Reinforced Company A, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The 164th's 60mm mortars were set behind the lines in order to place precise fire in front of the barbed wire. The 81mm mortars were set behind the 60s to hit the edge of the jungle that was beyond the range of the short shells. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 164th Infantry, were covered by 4 37mm guns, where the two joined at a narrow trail leading north to the Lunga Road. The 164th Reserves, consisting of 175 men of the service and anti-tank companies, and the 5th Marines to the west in Sector 5, moved southwestward to join with the left border of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. In the murky night of the 25th, the troops of the 17th Army struck in the same fragmentary manner as on the previous night, though this time the 16th Infantry, which had been behind the 29th Infantry the evening before, was the spearhead. The 29th had lost most of its muscle the day before, yet it was willing to fight on. Both regiments attacked along the entire front, supported by machine gun fire. Clusters of 200 to 300 Japanese hit the perimeter. Colonel Oka's force, which had been observed crossing the foothills of Mount Austin the day before, during the night hours of the 25th-26th, struck north at the diminished line of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, east of Hill 67, Saru, on the east bank of the Matanikau. The Japanese managed to breach the Marine line at one position and were fighting desperately at close quarters, but before they could organize, they stumbled around in the darkness, and a Marine counterattack forced them off the knoll. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herman H. Hanneken, Horrible Harry, meanwhile was in a bitter firefight near the coast, just east of the Matanikau River. At 0230 on the 26th, his battalion was attacked by a mixed force comprised of the 1st Battalion under Major Eiji Sekiya and the 3rd Battalion under Major Yasuhei Oneda, 230th Infantry, the 3rd Company under 1st Lieutenant Yokoi, the 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Yoshimatsu Onizuka, plus the machine guns of the 9th Independent Rapid Fire Gun Battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel Jukichi Yamamoto. The 2/7th Weapons Company under Captain Louis Ditter held back firing its 60mm mortars until the enemy was 30 yards beyond Hanneken's lines. The first wave of the Japanese was stopped cold, but others ploughed ahead. The Marines knew that anyone in front of them was the enemy, and when Colonel Shoji's infantrymen reached the top of Bloody Ridge, they were in a series of life-and-death struggles with the men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. The enemy pressure was relentless. Marines prefer to kill at a distance, 400, 200, 100 yards at tops. Man-to-man is not the preferred choice. The night of the 26th was one of terror. Remembering the ferocity of the battle, Sergeant Harry Weens, 3rd Battalion Wag Company, 164th Infantry, wrote in admiration of the supporting Marine artillery. The 37mm canister rounds were at first most bizarre. We had never seen any weapons flare out that way and weren't sure. Then the welcome blasts. Our Marine artillery was magnificent. They laid their rounds just forward of our wire and tore the Japanese to bits. It was an interminably long night. K and L companies were still in the path of the major charge, and they disseminated them. Come dawn, the Japanese pulled back. Then all too quickly the night was upon us. It was long, endless, unconscionably so. A total of 1749 enemy bodies were buried in front of our 3rd Battalion sector alone. Typical of the courageous battling on Bloody Ridge, now also dubbed Hanneken's Ridge, is the story of 24-year-old Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, a 6-year veteran and former China Marine. The section chief would receive a Medal of Honor for his actions at Bloody Ridge on the 26th of October. His machine guns, with their timing cams modified to double the fire, were set up bordering the edge of the jungle that neared the ridge. When the enemy broke through, Page and his machine gun crew of 36 were the only force standing between a wall of Japanese and their plan to shove the Marines into the sea. He directed the fire until all of his men had been killed or wounded. Then he single-handedly manned the first gun until it was put out of action by a burst from a Japanese weapon that shattered the firing mechanism. When it was destroyed, he took over another gun, then continued moving from weapon to weapon. 2 men were hit while they were bringing up ammunition. It had been a hectic night filled with brutal no-quarter encounters. When a new enemy force broke through at one stage, he picked up a 40-pound belt of ammunition, laced it around his shoulder, cradled the .30 caliber weapon in his arms, and headed for the oncoming Japanese, firing with fearless determination as he ran back and forth. The enemy must have thought a whole company was up there. The soldiers of Japan had run into a steel wall. By the next morning, Sergeant Page was tired, but still standing. Major Odell M. Connolly, the executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, had collected an ad hoc force of cooks, bakers, clerks, and radio men, and joined Page on the hill along with 2 platoons from Company C, 5th Marines, that were rushed to the crest. In the later stages of the battle, the indomitable Page organized and led a bayonet charge that drove off the enemy and prevented a breakthrough in the lines. The next morning, approximately 1,000 bodies were scattered in front of the 2/7th's position. Some 2,500 Japanese had attacked Page's platoon. Years later, Mitch Page would recall, "You know, a lot of the Japanese could speak English, and when their assault on us began, this guy started screaming, 'Blood for the Emperor! Blood for the Emperor!' And Henry Stansbury, he was throwing hand grenades and yelling back, 'Blood for Eleanor! Blood for Eleanor!' Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president. Bad as it was, I couldn't help but laugh. Chesty Puller had his own courageous Medal of Honor nominee, Sergeant John Basilone, a leader of 2 heavy machine gun sections of Company C, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. By 0330 on the 26th of October, C-Plas Brandon A. Nadeau had spread the word. They're coming. He would be killed in the attack. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reported that they were hit by 6 major assaults on their lines. When a pair of guns were disabled, Basilone had brought up replacements for the surviving crew members, repairing the other one, then operating it himself until help arrived. In the middle of the attacks, he had moved along the line, doling out fresh belts of ammunition. Much of the time he was exposed to the fury of the Japanese fire. On the 25th to 26th, the soldiers had carried out a bold attack against the seam between 2 battalions of the 164th Infantry, where the trail led northward. The infantry repeatedly pushed in toward the trail, but were driven off or killed by canister blasts from the 37mm guns and by weapons fire from the 164th Infantry's 2nd and 3rd Battalions. An estimated 250 enemy were killed in their attempt to take the trail that dark night. The 164th Reserves were on alert in case the 292 Hells Islands Japanese managed to break through, but the lines held. The assault forces pressed ahead with reckless courage until daylight, but each was beaten back. Their piecemeal attacks lacked staying power. On the 26th, the bulk of the battered Japanese forces withdrew to assess the damage. Lieutenant Miyazawa noted in his diary that Japanese losses in the attempt to take Mukadegata were 350 killed, 500 wounded, and 200 missing. The field hospital set up behind Mount Austin reported handling 1,600 wounded after the attack. 23-year-old Pierset Kamakichi Kusano of the 7th Company, 2nd Battalion, 29th Regiment, wrote, "The 29th attacked the first day and was led into a trap. The majority of the regiment was killed. The dead were piled 3 and 4 deep. Only 200 or 300 survived the attack. The next day, the 16th and the 124th regiments attacked. The 16th led and suffered greater losses than the 124th. The POW interrogation report for Pursi Morimitsu Kikuri, 10th Company, 3rd Battalion, 16th Regiment, states, "They took their regimental artillery and rapid-fire company along with them. On the 24th of October, they joined the remnants of the Oka Unit, 124th, in the attack on the airfield from the vicinity of Mount Austin. The POW, Kikuri, was sick at the time and did not go, but understood the 16th bore most of the blunt of the attack, as they were fresh troops. They were badly defeated, and only about 100 uninjured men returned. John E. Stannard, a sergeant with Company E, 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, Americal Division, wrote, "The carnage of the battlefield was a sight that perhaps only the combat infantryman, who has fought at close quarters, could fully comprehend and look upon without a feeling of horror. One soldier of Company E, after a walk among the Japanese dead, said to his comrade, 'My God, what a sight! There's dead Japanese stretched from the corner, Coffin Corner, back along the edge of the jungle for a half a mile. There must be hundreds of them, all dead.' General Nasu, the highest-ranking officer, was mortally wounded in the battle by shell fragments and died 6 hours later. Another diarist wrote, "The 26th of October 42. Last night, the night attack of the 3rd Bean, 124th Infantry, did not progress as we wished. They say that the Oka unit did not attack the enemy upon order, and he, Oka, left his unit and stayed at a point 2 kilometers east of the narrow Ipaubashi Bridge. It seems the commander does not know what to do with him." The unsuccessful night attacks of 25 to 26th of October marked the end of the ground phase of the October Guadalcanal counter-offensive. The headquarters of the Japanese 2nd Division was devastated, and the command center for the 17th Army began pondering the sobering reality that driving the Americans off the island might be an objective the Army could not afford. While the Japanese were landing troops and supplies at their end of Guadalcanal from the destroyers Shigura and Ariake, the Marines were receiving reinforcements. The 1st Depot Company at Noumea had managed to transfer a group of Greenhorn Marines, fresh from boot camp, into the form of the 2nd Replacement Battalion. They were most welcome and soon would be on the line. The old-timers, the men who had been on the island since 7 August, would have to teach those boots how to survive. On the 29th of October, the 17th Army's haggard and disorganized troops continued their retreat westward along the Maruyama Trail to Kokumbona, while the Shoji Butai worked its way east to Korisaki, Coley Point. Meanwhile, fresh from their victory, the 1st Marine Division began to think about striking at the Japanese to the west. After defeating the Japanese in their last major engagement, the 1st Marine Division was determined to disintegrate the enemy forces by attacking the command centre at Kokumbona, then pushing westward another 1.5 miles to the Poha River, some 11 miles west of the perimeter. What the command did not know was that more than 11,000 determined Japanese soldiers, along with a handful of their Guard unit troops, were in that sector. In preparation for the assault, the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 2nd Marines, had been transferred from Tulagi to Guadalcanal, and the 1st Engineer Battalion, less Company B, had been ordered to construct footbridges over the Matanikau River strong enough for tanks. The forces were to attack westward on the morning of the 1st of November in columns of regiments along a 500-yard front starting from the Matanikau River, the River of Death. Colonel Merritt A. Edson, commanding officer of the 5th Marines and hero of Bloody Ridge, was to head the force. He was General Vandegrift's preferred combat leader, often chosen for difficult tasks. PFC Herm Lewis, HQ 12, remembered Edson's blunt remarks to the troops just prior to the drive on Kokumbona. "If you don't get killed or wounded on this one," Edson told them, "I'll think you're screwing off." Lewis thought it was probably the only no-win injunction ever given to American troops. The lead formation in the drive on Kokumbona was to be the 5th Marines, backed by the 2nd Marines less the 3rd Battalion, plus Colonel William J. Whaling's Scout Snipers and the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Additional support came from the 11th Marines, less 2 batteries, the weapons of Battery A of the Army's 244th Coast Artillery, 155 mm, and Battery B of the 5th Defence Battalion, 155 mm, a small Coast Guard detachment from the Kukum Naval Base, and a handful of Martin Clemens's scouts. In support of the assault, SOPAC at Noumea had ordered the cruisers San Francisco, CA-38, and Helena, CL-50, and the destroyers Sterett, DD-407, and Lansdowne, DD-486, to shell the Japanese sector west of Point Cruz. At 0200 on the 1st of November, the jump-off patrol, led by Lieutenant Babashanian of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, reinforced by the machine gun unit, crossed the Matanikau River in rubber boats, raider style. They reached the west side 15 minutes later, where they remained as a guard force for the area. At daybreak, heavy artillery preparation fire was concentrated on the far left bank, while the remainder of 2/5 under XO Major Lewis W. Walt walked across the recently constructed footbridge at 0630, engulfed in fog. They were followed by the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines. Behind Colonel Edson's 5th Marines, followed by the 2nd Marines, were Colonel Whaling's Scout Snipers, who called themselves Daniel Boone Scouts. They moved along the grassy ridges to the south of the 5th Marines to protect the left flank. The heavy weapons companies of 3 over 1 2/5 under Lieutenant Colonel William R. Williams remained in position amidst the thick jungle at the edge of the Matanikau River to cover the American forces as they crossed. When in place on the west side of the river, 2/5 was on the left and 1/5 on the right. At 0830, 1/5 ran into Lieutenant Mamiya's 2nd Company, 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion. Mamiya's mortarmen pounded the Americans and fatalities mounted. It was a bad omen of what lay ahead. The Marines were in the prime area of the Japanese who fought to expel them. The Japanese 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, under Major Masuro Tamura, briefly blocked the American advance, taking casualties in doing so, but the Americans began attacking from both the river mouth and the beach. Elements of the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, remnants left from other encounters, were concentrated on the west bank of the Matanikau in the vicinity of the coconut log bridges upstream. but the Marines threw so much lead at the soldiers that they were able to contain them. Major Tamura's men sustained casualties caused by both ground assaults and Cactus Air Force air attacks, forcing the major to move back to the lines of Point Cruz, Kurutsu. Pockets of weakness existed along the American lines, however, and the Japanese slipped through those gaps, causing havoc. The enemy assault was brutal, typical of that sustained by CPL. Anthony Casamento of Company D, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a machine gun section leader. When the enemy attacked his position, his section was raked by deadly enemy fire, though Casamento's company also exacted a toll. Nevertheless, within minutes, all of Casamento's gunners were either killed or wounded. Although the corporal was severely wounded, he managed to knock out 2 enemy machine gun emplacements, protecting his company's flank and stalling the enemy attack. The deadly mortar fire also took a toll on the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and temporarily stymied the American advance, though it resumed the next day. The Americans faced a diversified force comprising the remnants of the Sumiyoshi Force, Lieutenant Tatsunosuke Takahashi's Yokosuka 5th SNLF, the first 3 squads of W.O. Katsuzo Fukimoto's 2nd Platoon, 3rd Company, Kure 3rd SNLF, members of the 84th Guard Unit, later reinforced by the 2nd Anti-Tank Company, 2nd Infantry Division, and the 39th Field Construction Unit, as well as the Okubo Force, about 100 members of the Kuma Battalion under 1st Lieutenant Yoshio Okubo of the 28th Regimental Anti-Tank Company, 28th Infantry Regiment, 7th Infantry Division. Warrant Officer Fukimoto and many others were subsequently killed in a skirmish on the 3rd of November. Colonel John M. Arthur's 2nd Marine Regiment command post was set up on the east bank of the Matanikau River. The 2nd Battalion established a defensive position along the east bank, providing command post security. This was the colonel's first opportunity to show leadership, as he had not seen combat before. He had spent 2 months in the rear area of Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides, until General Vandergrift ordered him to Guadalcanal, and thus the lesser ranks had called the colonel Tail-End Arthur, though certainly not within earshot. Arthur later would butt heads with U.S. Army General Alexander M. Patch, who rebuked the colonel on his numbers that claimed an overkill of Nippon soldiers. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, moved to a defensive position on the Matanikau's west bank and in the beach area at the rear of the 5th Marines bivouac. On the 2nd of November, one half moved again, covering a 400-yard front with the right flank on the beach. The 244th Coast Artillery Battalion opened up with their 155S on the Japanese artillery posts, the first effective counter-battery artillery available in the campaign. One cannoneer said, "If Pistol Pete can dish it out, we can serve it better." Over the course of the day, however, several men were killed by sporadic sniper fire. Meanwhile, back at the perimeter, 50 Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion had arrived on Guadalcanal, the rear echelon from the New Hebrides under Lieutenant J.G. Ernest K. Smith. They brought the balance of the equipment that they had been unable to ship earlier. Although ammunition, avgas, and food held a higher priority, the equipment was needed to maintain the Lunga Naval Operating Base, which day by day was being upgraded. The Tokyo Express, the Japanese destroyer resupply effort, continued with its mission. On the night of the 2nd of November, a convoy of 5 destroyers landed troops near Tetere, east of Coley Point. Members of 1st Lieutenant Tamotsu Shino's 2nd Company, 230th Infantry, and 1st Lieutenant Yoshiaki Nagata's 6th Battery, 38th Mountain Artillery Regiment, brought 650 bales of rice and 10 bales of powdered miso, bean paste, which they stored in the jungle. These troops were to join Major Eiji Sakiya's 1st Battalion, 230th Infantry, and Major Ampei Onoda's 3rd Battalion, with the 9th Company commanded by Captain Hitoshi Okada, the 10th Company led by Captain Hikoshi Suzuki, and the 11th Company led by 1st Lieutenant Susumu Imai. The 9th had been ordered to the Coley Point sector to protect the debarkation and the supplies. To the east, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, had sent F and G companies led by Captain Harry J. Connor, now the S3, the Staff Operations Officer, to surround the enemy near the beach area of Point Cruz and cut the Japanese phone lines. At 0800 the next day, the 3rd of November, E and G companies attacked, with the Marines of the Weapons Company as riflemen. Company F held the left flank as G advanced into the underbrush with close-in fighting. Over 200 of Tojo's soldiers were killed. Second Lieutenant Paul Moore Jr. of Company G won the Navy Cross for his assertive effort. To counter the enemy landing in the vicinity of Coley Point, General Vandergrift dispatched the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Herman H. Hanneken, supported by Colonel Bryant E. Moore's 164th Infantry Regiment. On the morning of the 3rd of November, Japanese foot soldiers, supported by artillery and mortar fire, attacked 2/7. The battalion was forced to withdraw to the west along the coast and back across the Metapona River, then across the Nalimbiu River. A radio message requesting assistance was sent to Division Headquarters, which in turn asked the Cactus Air Force for help. Aircraft attacked the Coley Point sector, but unfortunately struck both American and Japanese troops, causing casualties on both sides. Because radio contact between the Coley force and headquarters failed due to the thick and damp jungle, the Coley group could not tell the command center that the aircraft were inflicting casualties on friendly troops. The San Francisco, Helena, Lansdowne, and Sterett, which had been supporting the drive west, were now ordered to shell Japanese pockets on Coley Point. In the bombardment of the south end of the point, Captain Hitoshi Okada and Captain Fumio Dejima were killed, as well as many from Captain Hikoshi Suzuki's 10th Company. The next morning, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 164th Infantry, began a march through the jungle and across the kunai grass fields. They then proceeded to a position south of Coley Point to strengthen the Marines there. Firing in support of the operation were the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, the 1st Battalion, 11th Marines, and Battery A of the 5th Defence Battalion with their 155S left over from World War I. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was boated in to reinforce 2/7 at Coley Point. The plan was for the American battalions to hit the enemy force in place, while 2 battalions of the 164th enveloped them from the south. The Japanese 230th Infantry Regiment had placed 2 of its Type 97 field guns about 2,000 yards east of the Metapona River at Gavaga Creek, roughly 1 mile east of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, and pounded the American positions. Meanwhile, Colonel Toshinari Shoji's 230th Infantry remained in the Coley Point sector. Adding to the Americans' problems, Colonel Hanneken's 2/7 was unable to inform the division of a new enemy group landing because the 2/7 radio had been disabled. Hanneken's Marines encountered members of the enemy's 9th Company, 230th Infantry. By the following morning, elements of the 230th were eager to exit the area and thus moved west. Hanneken's 2/7 Leathernecks managed to engage the rear party, but were hit by a blistering hail of artillery and mortar fire. Brig General John E. Stannard, USA, Retirai, who at that time was a sergeant with Company E, 164th Infantry, later described the battle for Coley Point as the most complex land operation, other than the original landing, that the Americans had conducted on Guadalcanal up to that time. Stannard added, "Marine operations west of the Matanikau River had been as large, but they had mission bases on terrain objectives, to seize a certain location or to clear an assigned area. At Coley Point, the mission was to destroy an enemy force, and this was a more complicated task. The operation was further complicated by poor communications, American forces firing on one another, and inadequate direction, control, and coordination. The Americans learned once again that offensive operations against the Japanese were much more complicated and difficult than defeating banzai charges." PHM-1C. Charles O. Hall of Company D, 2nd Medical Battalion, offered a corpsman's account of the push west. On the 1st of November, we, 2nd Marines, moved up to the front, crossing the Lunga River and up to the Matanikau. On November 2nd, we crossed the Matanikau and immediately met resistance. The battle lasted several days, and we made little advance, our casualties were heavy. Early in the movement, we lost 3 hospital corpsmen to enemy fire. In the collecting section, Bruce Bender was killed trying to rescue a wounded Marine ahead of the front line, and PHM-1C Eugene Baxter was killed attempting to rescue another Marine ahead of the front lines. A sniper killed Baxter just as he was returning to the lines. Since we had no doctor, with Baxter's death, I became the senior medical NCO. Richard A. Nash, a Marine with headquarters 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, later described the events when Eugene Baxter was killed. Baxter, while taking over a position held by the 5th Marines, saw that a group of several hundred Japanese soldiers were trapped. They had the ocean at their backs, and we surrounded them on the land perimeter. They had no way to escape and would not surrender. They fought back, dropping mortar fire just yards between us, and spraying in our direction with machine gun and rifle fire. Most of us held our positions behind large logs that littered the area, but a few men were out in front with little cover. One of them was lying out there wounded and calling for a corpsman. Doc Baxter climbed over a log and ambled out to help the man, the red cross on his sleeve showing clearly in the morning sun. A Japanese sniper shot him dead. Suddenly a jeep wheeled up towing a 37mm anti-tank gun, and Captain Andrews of D Company put a crew of men to setting the thing up to fire into the palm grove. Then I heard it, just before the gun began firing, a weird wailing and moaning, almost a religious chant, coming from the trapped Japanese soldiers. Then the gun-fired canister shot into them, again and again, and after a while the chanting stopped and the firing stopped, and for a moment it was all quiet. Some of us went among the Leavers Brothers palm trees to look, and there, row on row, were the torn and shattered bodies of perhaps 300 young Japanese soldiers. There were no survivors. Back on November 3rd, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marine and the Whaling Scouts continued to advance inland. Meanwhile, Colonel Edson's 5th Marines successfully reduced the pocket at Point Cruz, where the Japanese paid a heavy price in casualties. The 5th Marines captured 12 37mm guns, 1 field piece, and 34 machine guns. In the final phase of the mop-up, they delivered 3 successful attacks. After the reduction of the pocket, the 5th Marines and the Whaling Scouts were ordered back to the perimeter, and it was then that Colonel Arthur, commanding officer of the 2nd Marines, took over tactical direction of the offensive from Colonel Edson. CPL James Sorensen of Company A, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines recalls, "Headquarters had radioed the airfield to come over and bomb and strafe and break up any Japanese counter-concentration. The planes came all right, 2 of them, SBDs. They plummeted directly on us, and 50 caliber slugs churned up the earth, while our planes strafed us. Then, as they nearly reached us, they loosened their bombs, 250 pounds. Both bombs hit dead in the center of the area where we had hurriedly dug our foxholes a few minutes before. The fighters circled out to sea and started to make another run. We feared the worst, but some guy yelled for all the skivvies, drawers and shirts the guys had on. The idea was to get them to the ridge top to make a panel before the planes got back. Guys all up the slopes were naked as jaybirds, and the planes swooped in again and actually caught us with our pants down. This time all the planes did was to zoom over at treetop level. Seems the radio got hot immediately and radioed the airfield to contact the pilots to lay off the fireworks. We later found out that we had gone beyond our objective that day and, in falling back, had really taken up our line on the original goal. When we asked for plane support, we found ourselves being bombed on our own orders. On November 4th, the American push west was officially halted, though for the men in the field the action continued. While the 2nd Marines were involved in the west, their sister regiment, the 8th Marines, under the command of Colonel Richard H. Jeschke, arrived from Apia, Samoa, with a complement of 4,010 officers and enlisted men. Although these were fresh troops, they soon were exhausted due to Guadalcanal's stifling heat. Within 2 days, on the 6th, they were in the front lines, quite a change from the dull garrison duty with the 2nd Marine Brigade on Samoa. First Lieutenant Dean Ladd of Company B, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines wrote, "Shortly after we landed, and as we observed the veterans of earlier fighting, our reaction was that they looked like men old before their time with their heavy beards, mud-crusted dungarees and khakis. At this juncture, the 8th Marines moved south to assist the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, in capturing Hill 4. The newly arrived 8th Marines began to suffer in the Guadalcanal heat, yet they continued to advance on a 600-yard front. By nightfall of November 6th, 3/8ths had lost touch with 2 halves, but the following morning contact was renewed and the attack continued. The 2nd Marines and the 1st Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, made little gains, and the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, was met with heavy mortar and automatic fire on its flank. By noon, they had advanced only 400 yards. Late in the day, the 11th Marines began firing, causing confusion in the enemy lines and supporting the movement of the 2nd and 8th Marines toward Cocumbona. The attack proceeded as planned, with one 164th on the right flank, 2 halves in the centre, and 1/8th on the left. On the south flank, 1 half protected the sector. The troops faced mounting artillery and mortar fire from the 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Masaji Kitayama's 10th Independent Artillery Regiment, and from Lieutenant Colonel Matsujiro Kaji's 20th Independent Mountain Artillery Battalion, all equipped with Bofors 75mm mountain guns. The Americans progressed slowly, and each move proved costly. At 1400 orders came to halt the advance in the face of the resistance. The Japanese were determined to hold the line. They wanted to protect the Maruyama Trail and the headquarters area of both the 2nd Division and the 17th Army at Cocumbona. If both fell, the Japanese would be doomed. Corporal Sorensen continues his tale. Late on November 9th, our battalion moved up and took over the foxholes on the opposite ridge. The former occupants strung out into the jungle and hooked up with an army battalion that extended inland from the coast, and we prepared for a big drive that was to enlarge our hold of the island. A battalion of newly landed 8th Marines moved into our vacated line and was to act as a reserve unit in this push. We prepared for the move and awaited orders to advance on the 11th. The night was cold, and our positions were overlooked by enemy artillery positions on Hill 4. On November 11th, our companies moved out and went straight through the Japanese line. We were to link up with the 8th Marines and cut the trail. Our advance met with sporadic sniper fire and occasional mortar shells, but our advance guards kept ahead. When we hit the end of the Japanese line, we struck a dense, thick bush area with dense tropical growth and tangled vines. It slowed our advance and took our men several hours to break through. It was raining on and off, and the weather was hot, humid, and steamy. Finally, late that evening, we made contact with the 8th Marines and learned that they had already moved through the Japanese line. For the next several days, the Americans continued to face the harsh terrain and determined Japanese resistance. Each night, patrols would scout the enemy positions, and artillery bombardments would continue to soften up the defences. As the American forces closed in on their objectives, they faced stiff resistance from the Japanese, who were determined to hold their positions at all costs. Despite the difficulties, the American forces remained resolute in their mission to secure Guadalcanal. For the next several days, the Americans continued to face the harsh terrain and determined Japanese resistance. Each night, patrols would scout the enemy positions, and artillery bombardments would continue to soften up the defences. As the American forces closed in on their objectives, they faced stiff resistance from the Japanese, who were determined to hold their positions at all costs. Despite the difficulties, the American forces remained resolute in their mission to secure Guadalcanal. By November 12th, the 1st Marine Division had succeeded in pushing the Japanese forces back and consolidating their positions. The battle for the Coley Point and surrounding areas had proven costly, but was a significant step towards securing the island. The American forces had demonstrated resilience and adaptability in the face of challenging conditions and fierce opposition. In the aftermath of the battle, the Marines and their army counterparts began to regroup and reassess their strategies. The lessons learned from the engagement at Coley Point, particularly the importance of effective communication and coordination, would influence future operations on Guadalcanal and in subsequent campaigns across the Pacific. The sacrifice and bravery of the Marines and the medical personnel like PHM-1C Charles O. Hall and PHM-1C Eugene Baxter, as well as the resilience of the troops in the 2nd and 8th Marine Regiments, were instrumental in the ultimate success of the campaign. The battle highlighted both the harsh realities of jungle warfare and the indomitable spirit of the American forces. As the fighting continued, the Allies' strategic objectives on Guadalcanal began to align more closely, setting the stage for further advances and eventual victory in the Solomon Islands. The determination and courage of the Marines in the face of adversity would become a defining element of their legacy in the Pacific theater. For the next several days, the Americans continued to face the harsh terrain and determined Japanese resistance. Each night, patrols would scout the enemy positions, and artillery bombardments would continue to soften up the defenses. As the American forces closed in on their objectives, they faced stiff resistance from the Japanese, who were determined to hold their positions at all costs. Despite the difficulties, the American forces remained resolute in their mission to secure Guadalcanal. By November 12th, the 1st Marine Division had succeeded in pushing the Japanese forces back and consolidating their positions. The battle for Coley Point and surrounding areas had proven costly, but was a significant step towards securing the island. The American forces had demonstrated resilience and adaptability in the face of challenging conditions and fierce opposition. The withdrawal of the 8th Marines from the forward positions and the reorganization of the American units highlighted the need for effective logistical and strategic adjustments. The shift of command and the infusion of fresh troops, such as those from the 8th Marines, were crucial in maintaining momentum and addressing the evolving battlefield dynamics. The Japanese, despite their determined resistance, were increasingly strained by the harsh conditions and the relentless American pressure. Their defenses, though initially formidable, began to falter under the sustained American assaults and the logistical challenges they faced. The battle underscored the brutal reality of jungle warfare, where terrain and weather played as significant a role as enemy combatants. It also highlighted the importance of adaptability and communication in overcoming such challenges. The efforts of individuals like PHM-1C Charles O. Hall and PHM-1C Eugene Baxter, who made personal sacrifices under fire, exemplified the courage and dedication of those involved. As the battle drew to a close, the American forces prepared for the next phase of their campaign. The lessons learned at Coley Point and the resilience shown by the Marines and their Army counterparts would influence subsequent operations. The success at Guadalcanal was a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater, setting the stage for further Allied advances and eventual victory in the Solomon Islands. The determination and bravery of the American forces, along with their ability to adapt to the challenges of jungle warfare, became defining elements of their campaign in the Pacific. The battle for Guadalcanal would be remembered not only for its strategic importance, but also for the indomitable spirit of those who fought there. The rain was relentless, causing the American offensive to move at a snail's pace. The 8th Marines, not accustomed to Guadalcanal's oppressive heat, advanced only 400 yards. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Haruyoshi Hyakutake was determined to hold Kokumbona. The American soldiers and Marines were heading his way. The 2nd Battalion, 164th Infantry, less Company E, had entered the fray and took up positions on the right of Colonel Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. At this juncture, the Leathernecks and the GIs held a curved line from the beach around a horseshoe bend in Gavaga Creek. The 81mm mortar crews of the 7th Marines pounded the enemy defences. The Japanese mortar crews responded. Blocked on the east and west, the Japanese immediately attempted to break out of the web, using concentrated automatic weapons fire and grenades. One small gap in the American lines remained open, a slough in the south, because the 164th Companies E and F, which were separated by a marsh, had failed to connect. The Japanese saw the breach, and the force at Gavaga Creek made its escape, but left behind 475 bodies. For the Americans, a pending sea threat caused a pullback. The 8th Marines, covered by the 2nd Marines, withdrew under sporadic but effective shellfire. The 2nd was near the Maruyama Road, and the Japanese fought desperately to keep the Americans from discovering their tree-covered route, pouring concentrated deadly fire at the Marines and forcing the Leathernecks to withdraw. By nightfall, the 2nd Marines and the 1st Battalion, 164th Infantry, had moved back to defensive positions east of the Matanikau River. Increased artillery and mortar concentrations were fired during this manoeuvre and throughout the night to keep the Japanese unaware of their activity. By morning, fresh reinforced patrols were sent out to protect the troops evacuating the supplies that had been impossible to move the previous day. The American withdrawal was completed within 2 days, leaving the sector to be reoccupied by the Japanese. By the 13th of November, the 2nd Marines had taken up positions east of the Tanaru River. When they added up their casualties west of the Matanikau, they had lost 35 killed, 133 wounded and 7 missing. The 8th Marines fared better, with 1 killed and 14 wounded. PFC Charles Cadwell of Battery B, 5th Defence Battalion, wrote in his diary. November 12th. At dawn, our Navy started shelling Japanese along the Matanikau River lines. 75 Japanese landing bar craft were seen at Tassafaronga. At 1300, an air raid occurred. At 1415, 23 bombers and 8 Zeros attacked our ships. November 13th, air raid at 0200. Friday, big Japanese task force reached here early this morning. Our lines near Point Cruz were withdrawn to this side of the Matanikau River to avoid being cut off. November 14th, at 0300, we were awakened by heavy shellfire around us from the battleship Kirishima and heavy cruisers Takao and Atago. Coconut trees were splintering and falling everywhere. By actual count, 125 large naval shells were aimed at the airfield, and shrapnel was flying like rain. When the shelling started, we piled sea bags around our foxholes together in an L shape so we could talk during air raids. This shelling was too big for foxholes, so I counted numbers between hearing the naval guns and when their shells hit. I took off for a covered air raid shelter as soon as I heard the guns. Unfortunately, there was a short shot and I was hit in the right knee, left chest and wrist with shell fragments and wood splinters on the way to the shelter. Inside the shelter, between sheer terror and wishing the thing would stop, we were all entertained by George Knoll, who had jumped into the shelter naked, and the mosquitoes were finding a ready target. He looked worse than I did when it got light. This shelling lasted 3/4 of an hour. Nevertheless, there was good news. While the Japanese did manage to land some troops on the Rock, of the 11 transports filled with reinforcements that Coast Watcher Paul Mason had reported from his post in South Bougainville, 7 had been sunk en route by the Cactus Air Force, by carrier aircraft, and by the B-17S of the Espiritu Santo-based 11th Bomb Group. 8 destroyers had rescued about 5,000 men from 6 of the sinking Japanese ships and returned them to Rabaul. From the 4 transports that made it to Guadalcanal's shore, the Kinugawa Maru, Hirokawa Maru, Yamura Maru, and Yamatsuki Maru, 2,000 troops managed to land, including elements of the 1st Battalion, 229th Infantry, led by Major Sugura Orita, the 228th Infantry, led by Colonel Sadashichi Doi, and the rear echelon 230th Infantry, 38th Division. However, they were mostly without weapons and materiel. They reached the shore with provisions for just 4 days and only 260 cases of ammunition. Lost at sea were provisions for 30,000 men for 20 days, 4,010 cm, 3,015 cm, and 15,000 anti-aircraft shells, all varieties of ammunition for the infantry units, and 76 large and 7 small landing craft. The diary of an unknown Japanese soldier, dated the 14th of November, reads, "For the first time in my life, I have experienced a great bombing attack. First, the ships sent up one flame after another from the decks and sank. In fact, 7 ships were destroyed. The remaining 4 ships arrived in the darkness. Oh, our fate is already decided. Since 3.30 this morning, dive bombers have fiercely attacked our remaining ships. Finally, at 5 o'clock, we had to give up all hope for the ship we came on. We have landed safely on Guadalcanal. Oh, Yamatsuki Maru, goodbye forever. Even if we take refuge in the jungle, there is no place without sweeping fire and bombing. This is the end. I can't smoke even 1 cigarette or eat 1 grain of rice. Everyone is worn out. On the 14th of November, the Cactus Air Force had temporarily changed its name for 24 hours to the Allied Air Force when a Royal New Zealand Air Force, RNZAF contingent from No. 9 Bomb Recon Squadron, flying British-built Ventura patrol bombers, Lockheed B-34, B-37, flew up from Espiritu Santo Island to augment the Guadalcanal air units. They were followed 10 days later by 5 Hudsons, Lockheed Vega AT-28 A-29, from No. 3 Bomber Reconnaissance Squadron. One of the RANZAF aircrew members, F. Sergeant David Tribe, was a radio man who often filled in as a gunner. In an initial briefing, the airmen were advised that if lost in enemy territory, they should not expect any mercy. If their plane went down, and all indications were that they would be captured, each man, rather than be taken alive, was to put a pistol to his mouth and pull the trigger. Barely on Guadalcanal's soil 24 hours, the New Zealanders understood the nature of the enemy. On the 15th of November, the Americans saw that 4 Japanese transports were lying along the Tassafaronga area in plain sight. Battery F of the 244th Coast Artillery Battalion had brought to the beach 2 155mm guns from its field position on the west bank of the Lunga River. The battery opened fire, and the transports began to burn. Meanwhile, the Cactus Air Force bombed the ships. 45 minutes later, the 3rd Defence Battalion's 5-inch batteries, guns from 1915, opened fire. In addition, the destroyer Meade, DD-602, sailed from its anchorage in Tulagi Harbour to shell the 4 transports and the supplies on shore. The combined forces of Marine, Army and Navy weapons and the Cactus Air Force turned the beached Japanese ships into burning wrecks. In his POW interrogation report, PFC Masatoshi Ikeya of the 1st Battalion Machine Gun Company, 229th Infantry, stated, 4 of the ships, including mine, the Yamura Maru, managed to reach the beach the morning of the 15th. All 4 of those were attacked later in the day and burned. Landing operations required about 1.5 hours. All the machine guns were landed, but very little provisions. Of the 229th, only the headquarters, 120-30 men, under Colonel Ryozaburo Tanka, 1st Company, 140-50, under 1st Lieutenant Masao Takeuchi, and 1 machine gun squad, 20 men and 2 heavy machine guns were landed. About 150 men of the regimental artillery also had landed, but I do not know if they had landed any of their guns or not. On landing, we went to the 38th Division headquarters at Maruyama, a point on the Oki River, Rove Creek, about 1 mile from the coast. Pertet Chino Shuji of the 52nd Independent Transport Company under Captain Watanabe had a different version. I landed on Guadalcanal the night of the 15th of November 1942. My transport was bombed by US aircraft and beached. The men had to swim ashore without their gear. They landed in the vicinity of Cape Esperance, and my unit of 100 men marched to Kokumbona. PFC Matsutaro Shijiri of Lieutenant Colonel Tsuneo Iwabuchi's Engineering Battalion, 38th Division, told his interrogators, "My ship was one of 11, but they were attacked by US planes on the 13th, and many ships were destroyed. 4 of the 11 managed to reach shore and were destroyed the following day. The entire engineering battalion landed safely. They did not bring any road equipment. Everything was lost. They only had chiefly picks and shovels." Private First Class Cadwell's diary adds, "Air raid at noon. I was temporarily treated by a corpsman because all doctors headed for the beach, following the sinking of 7 Japanese ships bringing reinforcements. Our camp was midway between the beach, between the Tanaru River and Lunga Point, and Henderson Field in the east and off Lever Brothers Coconut Plantation. The beach for hundreds of yards up and down and inland was covered with thousands of wounded, burned, oil-blackened and exhausted sailors who were washed in debris. I counted about 20 Japanese sailors who had washed in and were too badly wounded to resist. I remember seeing one Japanese lying on a stretcher. He had a blanket thrown over him and there were no legs. They had packed sand over the stumps to slow the bleeding. Late in the day on the 9th of November, the 8th Marines and the 1st Battalion of the 164th Infantry had formed the bulk of the force assigned to defend the Matanikau. They had established strong, entrenched positions on the east bank of the river and had sent out aggressive daily patrols, but this bold strategy had cost 34 wounded and 2 killed. Supported by fire from the cannoneers of the 1st and 5th Battalions, 11th Marines, the combined force executed a frontal attack on a 3-battalion front, with one 164th on the right along the coast, 2 halves in the centre, and 1 half on the left flank and rear. The Americans then dug in for the night. The next day, the advance resumed in the face of murderous rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. By 1200, the force had fought its way slightly beyond the point that had been reached on the 4th of November. With the Americans busy east of Kokumbona, the Iwatsuki Maru was able to nose into that sector on the 15th of November and discharge Lieutenant Colonel Tsuneo Iwabuchi's 38th Engineer Regiment. Captain Kiyoshi Saito's 3rd Company found immediate employment on a road-building project from the upper reaches of the Mizunashi River, Dry Creek, to the entrance of the Maruyama Trail, the place where the 2nd Marines had taken heavy casualties in the November drive on Kokumbona. Captain Kishi Akimasu's 2nd Company was attached to the 229th Infantry, mainly to move materiel. However, the project, the roadway that would help the Japanese carry supplies to the front, never fully came to fruition. After the disastrous Japanese reinforcement run, General Vandergrift saw an opportunity to rejuvenate the drive west. On the 18th of November, the Americans started to cross the Matanikau again. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 182nd Infantry, took the lead in the renewed westward effort. On the east bank, situated on the beach, the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, protected their crossing with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, in the centre, and the 8th's 3rd Battalion on the left flank. The 2nd Battalion, 182nd Infantry, dug in 1,000 yards west of the river. On the 19th of November, the 1st Battalion, 182nd Infantry, supported by 105mm howitzers of the newly arrived 245th Field Artillery Battalion, crossed the river with orders to seize the high ground. The Japanese resisted, pounding 2 182nds. The soldiers were reinforcing the sector. Major Suguru Orita, commander of the 1st Battalion, 229th Infantry, was wounded in the bombing and evacuated. On the morning of the 20th, a strong enemy force hit the left flank of 1 182nd with every weapon at its disposal and punched a hole in the American lines. The 182nd, the American Division's Minutemen from Massachusetts, reeled back with casualties. Combat was a new experience for them. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 164th Infantry were then shoved across the river to support the besieged 1 182nd. The 2 182nds stayed in position, and the 164th occupied a site adjacent to them. Bitter fighting continued, as did casualties, mostly as a result of dangerous aggressive patrolling in an attempt to make contact. The 8th Marines crossed the river, passed through the American Army lines and engaged the enemy. The Leathernecks from Samoa were becoming accustomed to Guadalcanal's blistering heat, and their combat readiness showed improvement. Meanwhile, the 2nd Marines remained east of the Tanaru until the 21st of November, when they returned to the perimeter west of Longa. Reconfiguring the line, Company A of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, which had taken a beating on the west offensive, was detailed for some better duty as guards for Fighter Strip No. 1, called the Cow Pasture, east of Henderson Field. The remainder of the 1st Battalion would be in defensive positions east of the Tanaru. The 2nd Battalion was in a defensive line along the ILU River and sent patrols to the east. Company F of 2 halves was ordered to replace one company of 2/5, which dispatched patrols to the southeast, while a segment of Company G set up an observation post 5,000 yards to the east along the coast route. Then 2 halves moved again when the 1st Battalion went into reserve along the west side of the Tenaru River, joining the 2nd Battalion in reserve adjacent to the old Japanese camp at Kukum, now the Cactus Coast Guard Station. By the 21st of November, the division had issued orders for the 2nd Marines to reshape the line west of the Lunga, replacing the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 1st Marines. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, occupied an area of 1,500 yards along the beach and 1,000 yards inland, replacing the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, then manned a post on the left of the 1st Battalion's line extending southeast along the ridge. Colonel Arthur's 2nd Marines command post was now positioned in a ravine southeast of the coral-faced fighter strip No. 2, which would be completed by late December. On Thanksgiving Day, the 1st Battalion, 147th Infantry, moved from swampy AOLA to Coley Point. 3 days later, it was joined by its sister battalion, 3 147ths. The 2 battalions moved inland to the foot of Gold Ridge, continuing to encompass the area to offer protection to the 14th Seabees, NCB, and the new 100-man medical unit of Acorn 1, Red. Meanwhile, shortages of supplies had affected both sides. On the 20th of November, Major Tadahika Hayashi, the 17th Army Cipher officer, reported to the 8th Area Army at Rabaul that the Oki Army was facing an immediate food crisis. 3 days later, Hayashi received a message that supplies were on the way. Sea trucks, small, slow-moving transports that travelled at 6 to 8 knots, were plying cargo between Japan and Rabaul every day, but they were too slow to deliver material to Guadalcanal. The supplies thus accumulated at the warehouses in Rabaul and at Buin on Bougainville Island, and were not reaching the front. Thievery from the warehouses was also rampant. The rear area troops were well fed, but the foot soldiers received little or none. The Imperial Navy thus came up with a plan to use submarines for the transporting task. On the 29th of November at Kamimbo Bay, a Japanese unloading point, the submarine I-9 offloaded 726 cases of provisions. 3 days later, I-31 landed 701 crates of supplies. The transport Kyushu Maru landed additional provisions and machine gun ammunition. All this would be carried to the lines and would be gone in just 24 hours. The Americans also were in need of provisions and ammunition. Ray L. Whitaker, a crew member of the Barnett, remembered a November supply run. We made one more trip to Guadalcanal. The island needed bombs, ammunition, and supplies. This was a small flotilla, the Barnett, the Alchiba, AK-6, which was a supply attack ship, and 2 World War I four-stacker destroyers. The Barnett was loaded with bombs and a compartment of nitroglycerine in the forward hold. In addition to supplies on board, the Alchiba towed a barge alongside, also loaded with munitions. If we were attacked by a sub and the destroyers didn't do their job, we were toast. Fortunately, we arrived without incident. The area was becoming more secure, but subs could be a problem. The Alchiba did likewise, and both vessels were anchored. The destroyers were patrolling the area. It goes without saying that when anchored, the wind will keep all ships facing the same direction. A terrible explosion occurred, not from the Barnett, but from the Alchiba. She had been torpedoed by a miniature 2-man sub, type HA. Sailors on the deck saw the torpedo coming as it barely missed the Barnett. It apparently had been fired in a way that it was lopping in the water, its power almost expended. It struck the Alchiba just below the bridge at the waterline. The captain got underway and beached his ship. The Barnett, for her own safety, got underway and left Guadalcanal for the last time. We later learned through naval reports that the Japanese torpedoed the Alchiba 2 more times. On the 29th of November, the rear echelon of the 14th NCB arrived at Coley Point from AOLA via a barge shuttle service. The Seabees' first project in December was to construct a bridge span across the Nalimbiu River, connecting the Coley Point area with the Lunga Zone by a road to Henderson Field. The timber used was native lumber cut and sawed by the Thick and Thin Lumber Mill, a name given to the battalion's carpentry crew. The Bees called it the Mahogany Bridge. Mahogany was better suited for furniture than for the construction of a bridge, yet it was certainly better than coconut logs. Previously, the 6th Seabees had cleared coconut trees and brush and built a road known as Johnson Highway, which ended near the Nalimbiu River. Between 5 and the 17th of December, the 14th NCB would start constructing an emergency airstrip, Coley No. 2, about 150 feet wide and 7,500 feet long, approximately 2 miles inland from the beach. Later, the 2nd Marine Aviation Engineer Battalion would construct 2 taxiways on the southern side of the field. Guadalcanal began sprouting airfields almost as fast as they could be built and maintained. During the Japanese occupation, lookout posts were established on Florida Island, Futo, just north of Guadalcanal. By early July 1942, a floatplane fighter base under Lieutenant Sida Richiro Sato had been established at Barango Bay off the village of Halavo. After the Americans conquered Tulagi, adjacent Florida became a minor theater, though it continued to occupy their attention. They believed that many Japanese troops swam to safety on Florida from Tulagi, Gavutu, or Tanambogo. Actually, only a few did so. In addition, the Americans feared that the Japanese could land in force on Florida Island and use it as a jumping-off point to strike at Tulagi and Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August 1942 D-Day, at 0740, H-20 minutes, Company B of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division, supported by the 4th Platoon of Company D, came ashore on Florida Island at the edge of a steaming, fetid jungle at Haleta Inlet. At 0730 that day, the 2nd Wave, Companies A and C, 1/2, had boarded 9 LCPs, then shoved off from the Jackson and headed for Florida to carry out a second landing. At 0830, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Hill, commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, put Plan U in effect. At H+30, Colonel Hill was to land Company C under Captain William S. Vasconcelos, a reinforced rifle company, to seize and hold the southeast sector. Company A under Captain William T. Bray was to land on the eastward side of the promontory south of Halavo at H+30 and seize Halavo village. The U.S. Navy would offer support by bombarding the Florida landing sites, while the landing craft were headed for the island. The Marines of this Halavo echelon, Companies A and C, had left their line of departure just as the tropical sky was beginning to break clear, and they could distinguish their green objective in the distance. By this time, many probably were wishing they were still in San Diego, where the temperature seemed ideal. The majority were 17 to 20 years old and barely out of boot camp. One was only 15. Some had never shaved before. It was a mixture of high school kids, college prospects, and old salts, men who had been in the Argonne Forest during the Great War. All had undergone robust training, yet almost none had ever seen a jungle, much less trained in one. John H. Bowler, then a 27-year-old platoon sergeant, described the situation. I was a Plat Sergeant 5th Platoon, Company D, and while boating to Florida we were attached to Company C as a heavy weapons platoon. This platoon was to hold the ground that the rifle company had taken during the day and furnish defence at night. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, had, at the time, many old-time Marines, men who had served during World War I, Nicaragua, and Haiti. A few names come to mind: Warren Goodwin, Walter Grant, Doggy, Peaseat William Wallace, and Master Gunnery Sergeant Klein. These were the old breed Marines, China hands, men who devoted their lives to the Marine Corps and the United States of America. Warren Goodwin was a section leader of the 5th Platoon, Company D at this time, having been up the chevron ladder numerous times. He was a sergeant and was well acquainted with the water-cooled machine gun, having used the same type in the First World War. Sergeant Goodwin was respected in the platoon and called Pappy because of his age and experience. Company C, with the 5th Platoon, Company D attached, and members of Company D Medical went ashore at Halavo Point, a short beach, to land at 0840. Their mission was to seize the village of Halavo and, if occupied, blow it away along with its defenders. The village was almost a day's march from the landing point, and there was very dense jungle most of the way. Midway along the march, we were taken under fire by some enemy 7.7 mm machine guns that were situated on Gavutu and Tanambogo Islands in Tulagi Harbour, about 1,000 yards away. We all hit the deck, surprise on all our faces because everything had been so quiet up until then. Quentin Hogan of Chicago was the first to react to the revelation. When he ran over to Sergeant Goodwin and shouted, "Pappy, they're shooting at us!" Goodwin very calmly said, "What did you expect, that they would come over here and kiss you?" We met no resistance in the village, so we settled down for the night. The first night in a combat area, even for the well-disciplined troops, is the worst night any man will ever experience in his lifetime. Imaginations run wild, trigger fingers twitch, and night sounds play havoc with one's nerves. A man was fortunate to survive the first night. Florida Island had some of the most dense, tangled vegetation to penetrate. With Halavo village as their target approximately a half-mile away, Companies A, C and D were to fan out, cut across the mangrove-choked beaches and clear the area of any existing enemy force. There was none. During the landing, on a small stretch of beach, Second Lieutenant Justin G. Mills was having difficulty with his coxswain, who was afraid to get close to the beach. The sailor wanted to pilot the Higgins boat to within a short distance of the island and discharge his passengers in the foaming surf. Mills looked at the young Coast Guardsman sternly, slowly unlatched the flap on his pistol holster, and calmly said, "Son, take us to the shore, or you will be sorry." A few seconds later, the craft was beached on the shore at Halavo. Squad leader Sergeant John Zingale was assigned to the Higgins boat carrying the wave commander, Lieutenant Edwin Schwammer. Zingale was ordered to take position on the left side of the craft, manning the dilapidated World War I vintage Lewis machine gun. He was instructed to open fire when they were approximately 100 yards from the beach. The first shot went off on time. On the second, the gun jammed. Fortunately, there was no return fire. As the Marines were disembarking at Halavo Point, the two minesweepers went to work clearing the waters. Their orders called for them to check for floating explosive charges in the area south of Gavutu. Early that afternoon, they would then head across the channel and sweep clean the Guadalcanal sector. No mines were discovered. The Japanese had not expected an attack. Bill Cannon remembers, August 7th was a fairly bright, sunny morning, peaceful with a slight mist rising from the lush green jungle at Halavo. Then the destroyers opened up on various pre-planned targets on Tulagi, Gavutu and Tanambogo, clobbering the target, but often hitting the Tulagi wall. We went over the side of our transport, President Jackson, by cargo nets to the waiting landing craft. We were ordered to stay below the gunwale, but just about everyone stood up long enough to see what was happening. I recall seeing a couple of large and several smaller splashes, including a string of machine gun slugs hitting the water around a destroyer that was firing every now and then at Tulagi. It suddenly dawned on me that a person could get hurt doing this. Our Higgins boat grounded, and we rolled over the gunwales, trying desperately to keep from being thrown under the bow every time the boat rolled from the crashing breakers, and to remain on your feet with a heavy load of gear strapped to your back. Finally maintaining my footing, I landed on a small sandy beach. Lieutenant Colonel Hill took off like a shot out of a gun. He was soon out of sight. There didn't seem to be much confusion, and the main object seemed to be getting off the almost non-existent beach and into the jungle by way of a fairly narrow trail. One of our objectives there was to seek out any artillery positions that might interfere with our landings on the nearby islands and destroy the hostile forces encountered. None were found. The day was beginning to get hot even early in the morning, and we were beginning to feel the heat, and the 70 pounds on our backs did not help this. After weeks on the President Jackson, I was stiff.